that the history of Islam is really two histories. There is a first history of Islam that ends September 12th, 1683. And then from that day until the present, there is the second history of Islam. Now, before I go on with the first and second history of Islam, let me say that in my judgment, and the judgment of a lot of others who know a lot more than I do, what we are witnessing right now in the world is an effort on the part of many in the Islamic world, not all, but many, in the Islamic world, to create a third history, which would be a return to the first history. But all that, I trust, will become clear here in just a few minutes. What do we mean by the first history of Islam? Well, what we mean is that for just about 1,000 years, as I said, the ending date is September 12, 1683. For a little over 1,000 years, from the death of Muhammad in 632 to this 1683 date, for about 1,000 years, Islam was more or less unchecked in the world. As historians would say, it was in the ascendant, apparently, for 1,000 years. Now, on close examination, it wasn't. There were already signs of its disintegration. Actually, sometime before 1683. But that was all basically ignored by leaders of the Islamic world for reasons that I trust also will become clear here in just a moment. In that first history, and it is so vast and so complicated, we can only hit some high spots, which again, I hope and pray we'll be able to make digestible. But in that first history of 1,000 years, what you have is an incredible worldwide expansion of Islam from its meager beginnings in Mecca and then in Medina, and then of course back to Mecca. In the short period of time that Muhammad had these visions and revelations that, of course, were written down after his lifetime, as you recall. And that period of expansion is almost bewilderingly rapid and extensive. Let me divide this up a little bit. We'll begin with what has sometimes been called the Muslim century. And that day, and it actually is exactly 1 century. It dates from the death of Muhammad in 632 to the defeat of the Muslims at the Pyrenees Mountains by Charles of Martel in 732, exactly 100 years later. Now, what happened in that 100 years is that, and if you can, I don't know how well you know your geography, but if you can think of the Middle East as kind of the center here of my arm waving. Here is Mecca and Medina, down here in the Arabian Peninsula, and here's Israel here, here's Egypt over here, kind of giving your perspective, so that's west, this is east. So from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam begins to spread very, very rapidly. Muhammad died in 632. By 636, already Syria is conquered. Jerusalem falls in 638. Egypt falls very quickly after that. By 656, 34 years after the death of Muhammad, already Syria, Persia, all of course the Arabian Peninsula, and about half of North Africa is already under Islamic control in 34 years. It is an astounding rapid development. By the end of that Muslim century, as we have called it, again, notice the graphic here, Islam has spread all across North Africa. And I need to stop right there and just tell you what an incredible thing this is to conquer. That it happened so quickly, because North Africa, I mean now, today, we think of North Africa as an Arab world, part of the Arab world. But in the time of Muhammad, North Africa was considered basically just another part of Europe. It's just across the Mediterranean of Europe. And it was really just an extension of the Roman Empire, and it was all Christian. You've heard me speak many times in sermons and Augustine was Bishop of Hippo, which is in North Africa, and considered just basically an extension of the Roman Empire. And so all these Christian lands in North Africa were Islamized within just a few years after Muhammad's death. And then it covers all of North Africa and then moves north across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain, conquers all of Spain. And as I said, 732 arrives at the Pyrenees Mountains. And it seemed at that point that this was a Muslim juggernaut that couldn't be stopped. And there was every expectation at that point on the part of the Muslims that they were simply going to march unimpeded into Paris. And they were going to conquer Europe, and it was going to be just that easy. And it almost was. There's a lot, I know there's not time to tell you about how there was kind of a last stand of the old Frankish Empire of Germany, what is now Germany and France, and somehow they managed to come together fast enough for the Muslims to be stopped. They're the Pyrenees Mountains, and they never advanced past the Pyrenees Mountains. Okay, that was on the west. On the east, they made it all the way to China and into India. They crossed the Indus River and made it into India. They conquered all of Persia, which of course is a different. It's not Persia's not Arab. It's it's Persian. And Iran today, even though they speak Arabic, they're not ethnically Arabs. They are Persians and a completely different line. And then moved northward. Islam did, as I've already mentioned, Palestine, Jerusalem taken 638, Syria, and then up to the Taurus Mountains, which is very near where the Apostle Paul grew up, in Cilicia, or Cilicia. And then they moved further east and north to the Caucasus Mountains, or the Caucasus. And I just got back from the region where the Muslims basically stopped that first time in the first century. The Caucasus Mountains are just south of Rostov, they're in Russia, southern Russia, and that was a natural area to stop. To the east of there, the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea, all to the east, headed towards Mongolia and China. They were able to advance that way and came all the way to the gates of the Chinese Empire. Never tried to actually to do much in China, but came that far. Now, this is within 1 century. From China in the east to France in the west, and all of North Africa in the Middle East, in 100 years. Now, at this point, let me shift gears just for a minute and add a little bit more to our study of this first history of Islam. I need to tell you about the 3 great Islamic movements. The one I just told you, the great Islamic century, the one I just told you is the Arab movement. But the Arab movement, after the defeat by Charles Martel in 732, the Arab movement begins to falter very quickly and very significantly. So that after about 750, AD 750, it ceases to be much of a power. What happens next is another great movement. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the Mongols, or sometimes called the Tatars, or the Mughals. These are all synonyms for the same people. We all know about Mongolia to the east, Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia today. And anyway, the Mongols have been given a short shrift in history. They are often overlooked and considered just a bunch of barbarians from the east who, by sheer numbers, simply overpowered much of the Western world. Well, that's a caricature that really isn't accurate at all. The Mongols were fierce warriors, and there were lots of them. But most Westerners had no idea the incredible military expertise of the Mongols and the extent of their empire. We can't imagine how vast it was. They did in fact conquer China. And then managed to hold China and what is today Mongolia and all of that eastern part of the world and all the way across the west and conquered Russia in the 13th century. So in the 13th century we have the arrival of the second great wave of what would become Muslims. Now when they start out they were Muslims, they were pagans, but they converted to Islam. And brothers and sisters, this is an incredible story. One of the Khans, Kublai Khan, actually sent ambassadors to Rome when he arrived in Europe, crossed the Ural Mountains and arrived in Europe. He sent ambassadors to Rome and asked for teachers to come to Rome to explain the Christian religion to his people because he was willing for his people to become Christians. It's a long story, but it's a fascinating story. At that moment, there was no pope. And in fact, there wouldn't be one for another 2 years after this message was sent, about 1269. And so no emissaries were sent. The request was basically ignored for 2 years. And when finally there was a pope elected, he sent a couple of Dominican priests to convert the whole of the golden horde of the Mongols. Well, it was a slap in the face. The Mongols considered they had not been taken seriously. And anyway, the rest, as they say, is history. They turned away from this message of the Christians, whatever it was, which, by the way, apparently was not even the proclamation of the kingdom of God. As H.G. Wells, the great English historian in his wonderful, wonderful history, on the history of the world, says that if those two priests had gone there proclaiming the kingdom of God, the way the Lord Jesus proclaimed it, as a worldwide, universal reign of the great sovereign of the universe, that would have been a vision big enough for the Mongols. But instead, they kept preaching about how the Mongols should subserve, should express their loyalty and obedience to the Holy See in Rome. Well, to the Mongols, this was a second-rate human power, not nearly big enough for them, and so they turned a deaf ear to the whole thing. And guess to where they turned? They turned to Islam. So, the second great wave of Islam was the Mongols. And as already said, in the 13th century they conquered Russia and all of Central Asia. We all know today about the stands of the old Soviet Union. Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and all the others. Well, these are all the remnants of the Mongol invasions and their Islamization in the 13th and 14th, up to the 15th century. Now that's the second great wave. The third great wave is the one that is of the greatest interest to us, because this is the one that affects our experience with and knowledge of Islam as it exists today. The third great wave of Islam is the Ottomans. You ever heard of the Ottomans? The Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Turks? Who are the Ottomans? Well, Turkish people, ethnically the Turks, in the 12th, even going back further than the 11th century, the 10th century, were a large group, ethnic population throughout Central Asia, occupying what is today the country of Turkey, which was known in the ancient world as Anatolia. And but from Turkey toward the east, you get into Central Asia, Armenia, and what is now, let's say, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all the others, and northern Iraq, northern Iran, and all that area up into the great steppes of Russia. Well, the Turks occupied Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, as well as much of Central Asia in what is today southern Russia, and northern Iraq and Iran. And whenever the Mongols invaded that region, the Ottomans, who were, they weren't all the Turks, they were just part of the Turks, into what is, in fact, today Turkey. And they grew in numbers, and they grew in strength, and they grew in power, and eventually they established one of the greatest empires the world has ever known, based in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans ruled from the 15th century until the end of the First World War. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire was established, and this is all part of this first history of Islam. The high point of this first history of Islam is the conquest, the sacking and the conquest of the city of Constantinople in 1453. The reason that's significant is that for many hundreds of years, Constantinople had been the capital of what remained really of the old Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had been sacked already in the 5th century by the Vandals and the Goths and such, these European tribes that had filtered in across the Alps and such. And so Rome was already weakened. It was a mere shell of what it had been. Just by the way, this is another history little aside. I mentioned a moment ago Augustine, who died in AD 430. When Augustine died, the Visigoths, one of those ancient, barbarian Germanic tribes, were literally at the gates of his city of Italy when he died. And they had already sacked Rome. And this was a great disillusionment to Augustine and so many people that couldn't imagine the eternal city that followed that had. So anyway, Rome had got weaker and weaker and weaker, and it was now basically a half-spent city, a rundown city that was ruled by a bunch of petty dukes and popes and legitimate and illegitimate claimants to various offices, and so it was a hodgepodge of rulers. And so the real seat of power had moved east to Constantinople. Well, this became known as the Byzantine Empire, and it was quite extensive for many centuries until the Muslims. And they began immediately to put pressure on the Byzantine Empire. As a matter of fact, even going back to the 600s and 700s, Muslims were laying siege to the city of Constantinople, but they never could conquer it. And so it stood for all those years until 1453, when it was conquered by Sultan Muhammad, the Ottoman Sultan, and Byzantium fell, and so the very last vestige of the old Roman Empire had now collapsed and fallen into the hands of the Turks. Meanwhile, it was the vision of the Ottoman Empire. Now, I want you to make careful note of this, because this is very important. It was the vision of the Ottoman Empire to conquer all the Christian lands for Islam, and to bring them all under the domination of Islam. And I'll say more about this later, but when they conquered, and this goes all the way back to the beginnings of Islam, when they conquered the land, they gave 3 choices. Unless you were a polytheist, if you were a polytheist, you had 2 choices: convert or die. If you were a member of the people book, i.e. Jews and Christians, you had 3 choices. Most of the time. Convert, die, or pay a poll tax and become a dhimmi, which means a second-class citizen. This is what happened in many places. Christians and Jews became dhimmis. They accepted the dhimmi Jew, and they had to pay a tax for the privilege of being a second-class citizen and not die. And this is what happened all over the Islamic world. Anyway, more about that as we have time, either this week or next week. So, 1453, Constantinople falls and becomes Istanbul. So the modern Turkish city of Istanbul is the old Byzantine capital of Constantinople. The great church in Istanbul, which was built by Justinian in 532, was, of course, sacked and turned instantly into a mosque, which is really significant. That was the high point. Now, I have to tell you that even as these things were happening and Constantinople was conquered, I mentioned earlier that there were actually signs already of some problems in the empire. And I'll mention just a couple of these. They occurred before the magic date of 1683. I'll just mention a couple. One of these is in 1529. The Muslims laid siege to Vienna. Now, Vienna was the capital of the great Habsburg Empire, and it was seen by the Muslims in those days. Well, of course, it was the most important European city at the time, and it was viewed by the Muslims as the crown jewel of the Christian world. If Vienna could be taken, then there would be nothing to stop the conquest of all of Europe. So in 1529. The Ottomans laid siege to Vienna, but they failed to conquer it because of bad weather, which is a fascinating story. If I can just stop here for a bracket and say that all through the history of the Islamic conquests and attempts to conquer, there are so many instances of what, as Christians, we just have to shake our heads and say, it's the providence of God that we're all must be arrogant tonight. Well, that was one of them. The siege was left off 1529. Another remarkable event occurred on October 7th, 1571. It's known famously as the Battle of Lepanto. It was a sea battle. It occurred in what we know today as the Gulf of Corinth, in Greece, of course, on the western side of Corinth. And it pitted roughly evenly matched navies of the Ottoman Empire and what had been formed to oppose the Ottoman Empire, known as the Holy League. Now, the Holy League is actually founded on two different occasions, beginning in the 14th century and then on into the 16th. But that's not important right now. What is important is that the Pope called for a season of fasting and prayer for the Battle of Lepanto. The Navy was sent there, and again, don't read all the details, but the bottom line is it was an extraordinary victory, and the Holy League defeated the Ottoman Armada. It was something similar to the British defeating the Spanish Armada in, 1517. But this was an incredible victory, and it was viewed as the salvation of Europe. Now, the Ottomans didn't view it that way. In fact, the Sultan asked his chief vizier how long it would take them to rebuild their fallen nation. And the vizier responded with words like this, I'm paraphrasing, that the wealth and might of our empire are such that if we wanted to make anchors of silver and sails of silk and ropes of satin, we could do so tomorrow. And they did. They did rebuild, and they did do some more conquering and such, but the Battle of Lepanto was a kind of a change point, because for the first time, the Ottoman Empire had experienced a crushing defeat in the hands of Christians. And it was the first great defeat of real magnitude of Muslims by Christians at all. Well, that brings us up to the end of this first history. And that's September 12th. You probably noticed this date, don't you? September 12th. Not the 11th of that. September 12th, 1683. The second siege of Vienna ends. The Ottoman Turks tried again, 100 plus 150 years after the first siege of Vienna, which failed. And 150 years later plus, they try again. And this time they feel they rebuilt their armies, and they feel they're prepared. By the way, they had conquered Buda and Pest in Hungary. There were two separate cities. Now we call them Budapest. It's actually two separate cities on outside of Danube. But siege to Vienna, and they had literally come to the last straw. But a kind of, how do you call it, a confederation of different kingdoms, Saxony, Lithuania, a number of others, all led by the Polish king, Jan Sobieski. John III, Jan Sobieski, Polish king, who personally led the troops in battle, all this confederacy. The amazing thing was that all these Europeans actually agreed on something. Anybody who's ever been to Europe knows, well, it's just, it was an extraordinary event. And once again, the Pope called for fasting and prayer. And on September 12th, in a battle that lasted over 5 hours, the troops arrived the day before on a hill behind the city and saw the outline of the troops and where they were. And Jan Sobieski deployed the troops in just the right way. It was masterfully done. And as I said, within 5 hours, set the Ottomans in a rout. And according to the accounts, it took days and days and days for the soldiers to collect all the plunder that was left behind. Including, this is a little aside for you, you might think that I have interest in this. You know, I've been to Vienna a couple times, and Vienna is famous for coffee houses. Now, the tradition is, and there is a lot of basis for truth in this, the tradition is that when the Ottomans were defeated that day, and in their haste to get away, of course, they left everything behind, and part of what they left behind were vast stores of coffee. Because the Arabs at that time, the Ottomans, had a monopoly on coffee. And they left behind vast stores, which the Europeans, of course, confiscated, discovered how they could taste really, really good. I don't think they had espresso machines, but they're probably working on it. And that using this coffee, taken from the Turks, they opened the first coffee house in Austria. That's the story. By the way, there's also a legend, and probably just no real basis to this. There is a legend that, you know, the pastry, the croissant, we say croissants or something like that, but it's a croissant. And it's a French word for crescent. The crescent of Islam. And supposedly it was baked in honor of the victory at Vienna. Well, anyway, this is a turning point, and this leads us to the second history of Islam. And I've got to hurry because my time is really getting away. The second history of Islam. And as much as the first history was a history, was 1,000 years of almost unchecked expansion. The second history is a history of almost unrelieved failure and disintegration. The whole thing unravels. It is unbelievable. Let me just read off a few of the events here, and this is just a few. I want to mention Vienna. 3 years later, in 1686, the city of Buda, the Hungarian city, was taken back by the Christians. In 1696, I learned about this firsthand, being in Russia the last couple of weeks. I asked about the history of the Rostov region, which is southern Russia, and it's famous, because it was in Rostov, there on the Don River, on the shores of the Black Sea, that Peter the Great, in 1696, retook the Russian lands from the Ottoman Empire and established Christian control over much of Russia. In 1798, a famous French general named Napoleon entered Egypt, a stronghold of the Ottoman Empire. And the Arabs, or the Turks and the Arabs together couldn't drive it out, but yes, he did. A young, upstart admiral named Horatio Nelson. Admiral Nelson of the British was able to root Napoleon out, which historians remark is itself an incredible thing, that the whole Ottoman Empire couldn't drive out Napoleon, but one young British admiral could. It took a Christian admiral to drive out another Christian, in this case Catholic, occupier. A number of other things in let's see, which one do I want to use? I've already mentioned Russia and all the events that took place there. Let me, my time is so fast going. Let me just fast forward. I'm going to say forward here. Several things happened in the 1800s that are notable, 1700s and the 1800s. Among them, for the first time in history, a Muslim power had to sign a treaty, a peace treaty, where they gave up lands they formerly held. They'd never done that before, and had to do that in the 1700s and then all the 1800s. Well, let's fast forward to World War I. World War I brings us into the Ottoman Empire. And there was just steady disintegration. Many different events took place that were eroding the Ottoman Empire until finally, and this is the two great humiliations of the Islamic world. When World War I ended, the victorious European powers simply sat down at a table and divided up the Islamic world. Now, let me give you the second one, and then I'll come back, and I'm going to explain why September 11th is so important. It is important. But the other great event happened that was actually an outcome of the First World War II, even though it didn't come until after the Second World War, is the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, May of 1948, the resolution. And the reason I say this is really an outcome from the First World War, when the First World War ended, the British issued a mandate in agreement with the League of Nations, and France did too, and dividing up the Islamic world. They allowed Turkey to keep its own country. The Germans basically controlled Turkey, which was another side of the face. Here were the Lutherans in Germany controlling Turkey. But the French controlled Lebanon. That's why today the second language in Lebanon is French. And much of Syria. And the British controlled Palestine and most of Jordan under what was called the British Mandate. And at the tail end of the British Mandate, the British wanted out of it. And they had always pushed. They wanted a state for Israel to repatriate the Jews. And long story short, against all the objections, and today it would be unthinkable. They could even happen. But in May of 1948, the UN passed a resolution allowing or authorizing the reestablishment of the state of Israel. And there are already thousands of Jews back in Palestine. They've already been migrated back in under the British Mandate. Now, this is what brings us to September 11th. People ask all the time, why September 11th? There's such a thing as that. And out there on the web, there are all kinds of theories about it. There's one website that lists all the incredible things, the incredible list of things that happened September 11th. And coincidences, and some of that involves adding a bunch of numbers together, coming up with 11 and all this kind of stuff. Well, you can do that what you will. But I'll tell you why September 11th is important. Some people speculate that it was the fall of the failure of the siege at the end of 1683. That was September 12th. Although that would have been September 11th here. But anyway, that's speculation. We don't have to speculate about what it was. Osama bin Laden himself told us. I have here Osama bin Laden's speech that he delivered October 7th, which, by the way, I don't know if there's any significance to this, but that was the date of the Battle of Lepanto. Anyway, this is a transcript of Osama bin Laden's speech on October 7th, 2001, when he was, of course, praising Allah for the carnage and all that happened. And I'm going to read just one paragraph. He says, "And what America is facing today is something very little of what we have tasted for decades." Listen to this line. "Our nation, since nearly 80 years, is tasting this humility." What does he mean by that? me by nearly 80 years. Here's exactly what it is. On September 11th, 1922, 79 years to be done. That was the day that the British mandate was proclaimed in Palestine. And it's a matter of historical record. I've had it in my history books at home. It's a matter of historical record. On that date, the Arabs proclaimed a day of mourning. That's why I was talking about and said, our nation, since nearly 80 years, is tasting this humility. And he goes on to talk about how this is our response to this. Well, that's what I meant by the third history of Islam. Some would like to see, since the British Mandate of 1922, it was announced, it was passed, ratified, and announced in 1922, became effective in 1923. And since then, there's been a tremendous rise in the resistance of and aggression of various Arab groups around the world. And as you know from reading current affairs, it's been increasing rapidly in the last few years. Okay, I have just a couple of minutes, and I haven't done anything like all that I hope to do, but I hope you get some idea of what has happened over these centuries. Let me close out with this. The question is often asked, how, going back to that first history, how could it have happened? And I find myself marveling at this. When I told my dear wife, I said, the more I study this, the more amazed I am that Islam could have had this incredible success for so long. How? Well, this is not exhaustive. We don't have time to be exhaustive, but let me just mention 2 or 3 things and wrap this up. One thing I'll suggest is that the Christian world itself opened the doors wide open. In a number of ways. Think about this. It is no coincidence. They are cause and effect kind of correlation. It is no coincidence that the rise of Islam coincides with the Middle Ages, and that the disintegration of Islam coincides with the Renaissance and the Reformation, and the rebirth of the development of Christianity. The Christian world in the Middle Ages was, well, let me read this one thing to you. I've got some quotes here. This is a fascinating quote. In 1562, the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire to Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire, wrote this about how close we were to being overrun by the Muslims. And here's what he said, I quote: "On the Turk side of the resources of the mighty empire, strength unimpaired, habituation to victory, endurance of toil, unity, discipline, frugality, and watchfulness. On our side, the Christian side, is public poverty, claims of poverty, Christian teaching, but private luxury. Impaired strength, broken spirit, lacking endurance and training, the soldiers are insubordinate, the officers avaricious, there is contempt for discipline, license, recklessness, drunkenness, and debauchery of life, and worst of all, the enemy is accustomed to victory and we to defeat. Can we doubt the result of the day? The only thing that stands between us and complete annihilation is Persia." And he's referring to the fact that the Ottoman Empire was having to fight the Persians, and so their attention was distracted. And he was saying, the only thing, and he said, they'll soon deal with Persians, and when they do, there's nothing against us. There's nothing to save us. We're too weak. That was part of it. The second reason I would submit, and I can show you won't read this in history books, but I absolutely believe it's true, is that the rise of Islam also coincides with a wave of anti-Semitism on the part of Christians. One of the reasons the Islamic world was able to be so successful in Spain for so long, by the way, they controlled Spain until 1492, January 1492. And one of the reasons was that the Jews were happier to live as second-class citizens under Islamic control of Grenada than they were to face the Inquisition. At least, here they live. God said in His Word that He would bless those who bless His people, and He would be the enemy of those who oppose His people. And for centuries, Christians were anti-Semitic. And in my judgment, this is part of what God used in them. Another factor in all this is that the Islamic religion, by its nature, is a religion of domination. And I can't stress that too much, but I can't stress it any more tonight because of the time is gone. So we'll talk about this more next Sunday night. Whenever we finish up, we're going to talk about Islam and prophecy, and all these things will kind of come back to bear, and we'll be able to rehearse some of them and deal with more in detail some of them. So there's a quick 1,400-year tour in 40 minutes, so I hope it's some fun, and hope to see you sometime. Okay, for those of you who are guests with us tonight, we do have our annual budget meeting tonight. You're most welcome to stay. You're welcome to stay. It should be a lengthy meeting, but you're welcome to stay. But we understand that you might not want to. So we'll take this moment here, we'll over to the sanctuary, and reconvene there in just a few moments. Let's have a word of prayer here, and then we'll see you over there.